Good morning, everyone. Today we're covering lesson 110, and it's a bunch of graphs, and I don't tell you very often that you have to memorize things, but this time you do have to. So you need to know that a parabola, oops, didn't do that very well. A parabola, gosh, it's hard with this stylus, sorry. Let's try it a different way. We'll just graph the parabola first, and then we'll put the axes in. There we go. Alright, so that's f of x equals x squared. If a curve is like this, like that, that's f of x equals x cubed. You have a graph that goes from here like this. That's f of x equals the square root of x. And then if we have a graph that goes like this in a sharp V shape, that's f of x is equal to the absolute value of x. Now those you just have to memorize. Alright, so now what we're going to be doing to these things is we're going to be translating them. So if I have a graph that, let's see if I can do this, has its vertex right here, 1 unit up, then the graph becomes x squared, which was the original, plus 1 because it moved up 1 unit. Same thing if I have the graph of the y cubed one, and instead of going through the origin, if it goes through right here, then it would be g of x is equal to x cubed plus 1 because it shifted up 1 unit. Okay, when you move up and down, you literally add or subtract whatever number you're changing the graph by. So here, this one, little guy starting right here, that's the x squared graph. So that would be h of x is equal to the square root of x plus 1. And then lastly, if we have the absolute value graph, and it's up 1, and they called that p of x, so that would be p of x is equal to absolute value of x plus 1. I'm going to go back and change these variables really quick like. This was supposed to be a g, and this one was supposed to be an h, and this one is supposed to be a p. Alright, so now everything matches up. Okay, so then what if we want to make it go down? We want to shift it down instead of up. So if we have a parabola whose vertex is down here, now what we did was we took the f graph, which was x squared, and we moved it down 1. And the same with the cube. If it goes through this point, it moved down 1. So g of x would be x cubed minus 1. And with the square root graph, if it starts down here, then that would be h of x is equal to the square root of x minus 1. And finally, the absolute value starts down here. Then that would be p of x is equal to absolute value of x minus 1. So like I said, when you're moving the graph up or down, doesn't matter which, you're actually going to state. If it goes down, it's going to be minus whatever the number is. If it goes up, it's going to be plus whatever the number is. All right? Okay, so the first example is on page 463, 110.1, and it says sketch the graph f of x equals absolute value of x plus 3. Well, remember, the absolute value graph is always a sharp V. All right, all we're doing is shifting it up 3 units. Okay, so we go here, go up 1, 2, 3. There's the corner of it, and it just goes like this. I mean, you could graph points exactly and go through that one, that one, that one, that one, all the way up. Up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1. All right? Okay, now then we're going to talk about horizontal shifts. That's moving it left or right. Okay? If I'm moving it right, it's going to tell me minus inside parentheses, and if I'm moving it left, it's going to have a plus. And the reason that we do that is if you think of, like for example, when we have something that's factored like this and it's set equal to 0, we set each factor equal to 0. And what happens? We add both sides and we end up getting the opposite number, don't we? Okay, so in order for us to move left or right on the graph, we're going to have to read the opposite of whatever it gives us in parentheses. Not like this one. This is not in parentheses. This strictly tells us go up 3. All right? So the next ones, down at the bottom of page 463, okay, we've got that same parabola, but this time the vertex is over here. So it's moved 1 unit to the right. And that equation, remember I told you it's going to be the opposite, is going to be x minus 1 squared. Okay, if we take the cubic and we move it to where it goes across here, it moved 1 unit to the right. So it's going to be g of x will be x minus 1 cubed. Okay, then the square root. If it starts here, then that's h of x is equal to the square root of x minus 1. And finally, the absolute value, if it starts over here, then that would be p of x is equal to the absolute value of x minus 1. So for horizontal movements this way, it's always going to be the opposite, but it will be grouped with the x. Always grouped with the x, either in a bracket or parentheses. If you recall, back here, this absolute value of x plus 3, that's not grouped together. That's the absolute value of x, and then the plus is on the outside of it. Alright, so what if we want to go to the left? So if we want to take this parabola, we want the vertex to be over here instead. So now I want 1 unit to the left. So that's going to be f of x equals x plus 1 quantity squared. Remember, it's got to be the opposite. With the cubic, if it's going through here, oops. No, that didn't go through very well, sorry. I think this stylus wasn't made to be used 1,000 times, and it's being used 1,000 times. So I want to go through that point right there. All right, so g of x is equal to x plus 1 cubed. And then you can probably guess for the square root, if it starts over here and goes across, then that would be h of x is equal to the square root of x plus 1. And then finally, if we have the absolute value and it starts here, like that, would be p of x is equal to the absolute value of x plus 1. Always the opposite when you're moving left or right. Okay, so on page 464, let's do a practice one of these. 110.2 says graph f of x is equal to the square root of x minus 3. Alright, that's grouped with the x, so this means it's going to move the opposite direction of that, so we're going to move it to the right 3 units. Okay, and remember what the square root of x looks like. It would ordinarily start at 0, 0, so it's going to go 1, 2, 3. It's going to start right here. And that's the graph. Okay, now then let's make one other change. Look at the bottom of page 464. If I have that same parabola, but I want it to open down instead. So that's f of x equals negative x squared. And if I have the cubic and I want it to come down, it's going to go like this. That's g of x equals minus x cubed. Then if I have the square root, I want it to come down. That would be h of x is equal to minus the square root of x. It's just reflected on the x-axis. Okay, it's just like you take the graph and you flip it about the x-axis. Then lastly, we would have the absolute value, which would just come down like this. So that would be p of x is equal to minus absolute value of x. Okay? So if you're just going to flip it about the x-axis, you put the negative out in front of everything. Alright, so on page 465, I think we can do that one here. Sketch the graph of f of x is equal to minus x cubed. Okay, so remember that's reflected about the x, so instead of going up like this, it's going to come down. Alright? So I want to erase this so I don't have it on here. It's going to come down through here instead. Okay, so now let's try one that does more than one change. So this one says f of x is equal to minus the absolute value of x plus 3. Okay, so minus the absolute value of x means it's flipped down. Okay, if it was just minus absolute value of x, it would be like this, wouldn't it? But then it says to shift it up 3. So in order to shift it up 3, this point right here is going to go up. Oh, goodness. I don't know how I did that, guys. Sorry about that. This point is going to have to go up 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, it's going to go like this. No. 1, 2, 3, like this, and like this. I could have done a little bit better job of that because it's going to go through that point, that point, that point, that point, that point, that point. So it would actually look more like this. Okay, so that was a combination of changes. This, put it upside down. And this moved it up 3.